Hello, I'm Julie Phillips, and I'm here today to talk about a case study on the Tule elk, Cervus canadensis nanoides. And so this is your beautiful Tule elk that you have in the state of California. And as we begin this discussion about talking about Tule elk, we want to ask a few questions. Are we simply resource managers, or do we find a third choice in protecting biodiversity? So one of the things you're discovering in environmental science, one, is the concepts of biodiversity. What is this beautiful diversity of life on Earth? And that includes animals, all kinds of animals and other wildlife, including the Tule elk. And so really, my question to you today as we go through this is, what do you think about this concept? Do we find a third choice or a different way to approach wildlife? So you can see some of the images here. Tule elk and other elk have really pretty much been seen as something to be hunted in the past. And so how can we use the concepts of sustainability, sound science, and stewardship to make decisions? And what we call ecosystems thinking, thinking not just about the elk, but the bigger picture. How do the elk fit into the landscape, into the local ecosystems, how important they are in the restoration of that landscape, and so on. So the 20th century has been managed pretty much by what we say hunting quotas and this whole concept of management. So it was really the concept of looking at preservation, which is to protect something, or conservation, which is the wise use of resources. And so resource management in terms of the elk have been pretty much, and just wildlife in general in California and across the nation, have been this concept of predator control. We kill the predators, the bobcats, the coyotes, certainly the wolves. We wiped out all the wolves in California a long time ago. And they use this concept of law enforcement for resource agencies. And there's always a preference for the prey species, those species that we can maybe hunt or so on, so deer and elk and so on. Hunting has really dominated the management strategies. Livestock is often given priority over native species, especially on public lands. So obviously private landowners can do what they want, but when we talk about public lands, livestock has been used to graze on public lands, and they're often given priority over native species. And this is kind of a big one for elk to kind of remember. And parks and reserves, like our national park system, our state park system, and other reserves, have defined boundaries which were created in many of their mission statements to protect species. And also, there's few, if any, buffer zones for wildlife. So how do wildlife move between different lands, different parks? And so what happened as a result of this kind of resource management concept is that species, like the Tule elk and other species, and ecological diversity went into a decline. So let's now focus on, first off, the North American elk. Originally, there were 6 subspecies of North American elk. Cervus is the genus, species is canadensis. So Cervus canadensis, and originally you can see here in this drawing that there were 6. So this was the eastern elk. This was the Manitobanus elk, Merriam's elk, the Rocky Mountain elk, you can see in here, the Roosevelt elk, and then the Tule elk. So if you look at this map of the United States, you can see that we originally had 6 subspecies of North American elk. 3 are now extinct, or some people say 2. So the eastern elk was wiped out many, many centuries ago. The Merriam's elk has disappeared. Some people now say they've seen the Manitobanus elk, so they're now considered still viable population. And we still have the Rocky Mountain elk, the Roosevelt elk, which are the largest of the 6 subspecies, which is found in the Pacific Northwest. They're just beautiful. We get to see those in the northwestern part of California, as we get to see the Rocky Mountain elk in the extreme northeastern part of California. And then you can see here the Tule elk population. So here's the Roosevelt elk, sometimes called the Olympic elk, Cervus canadensis roosevelti. It's the largest of the subspecies found in California. So look at it. It's just, isn't it beautiful? So this is Cervus canadensis roosevelti, or the Roosevelt elk. And again, they're just really quite spectacular. And here's the Rocky Mountain elk, which again are also found in extreme northeastern part of California. And these are the cows. Females are called cows and males are called bulls. And aren't they just beautiful? And then here is your native Tule elk. In California, we have our own subspecies of North American elk. So I'm going to say this again because this is an important one to write in your notes. California is the only state that has our own subspecies of North American elk. It's what we call a California endemic species. This subspecies of North American elk is again found only in California. So here you can see the male with its antlers, and the little young guy, a little yearling or so, and then here's the cow, the female. And so here's kind of a case study that's important for us to learn from the past. Here was the original distribution of elk. So again, in California, we have the Rocky Mountain elk over here, the Roosevelt elk over here. This shows, the red in here shows the present distribution, so some of their range has been diminished. So we have a very small population of Rocky Mountain here, and the Roosevelt elk here. And this shows you the original home range of the Tule elk, our California endemic. And this dates back into the early 1800s. They went as far north as the Mount Shasta area. They went up to the foothills of the Sierra. They did not go up to the high Sierra. As far south as Bakersfield, Buena Vista area, along the coast in most areas. And this is, again, the original distribution. By 1860, the Tule elk had been reduced to this area. By 1870s, the Tule elk were found only in this Buena Vista area. So it's really the decline of a subspecies North American elk, a California endemic. Again, you can see here the pattern. So the elk were hunted for their meat, fur, and lard extensively. There's the original distribution. In the 1840s, they still had a pretty large range. By 1849, you can see they had been reduced, but look by 1860. And then by 1874, it was thought the Tule elk were extinct. And then something pretty amazing happened. A rancher by the name of Henry Miller found a small population of elk on his property in the Bakersfield, Buena Vista area. He ordered his ranch hands to protect them with guns, which they did. And eventually the Tule elk numbers increased. The map looks a little different now, but you can see here that eventually they began to try to restore elk into their native habitat, which is called reintroduction. They also introduced elk into places like Owens Valley, which is on the eastern part of the Sierra. That is not part of their original range, so those were introductions. And so fairly typical how management has worked in the past. The decline of the Tule elk in the 1800s. Then they used a management by trial and error. How do we protect these things? But then what came around starting in the late 1960s, early 70s, was there was legislation passed, both state and federal, that said we're going to do responsible management. So they created the Bear Bill in California under the California State Senate in 1971, and the Tule Elk Preservation Act, the federal law, which was 1976. So these laws were actually enacted to help protect and let the herds increase. So this Bear Bill, again in 1971, prohibited the public hunting of elk in California until the state population exceeded what? What's it say right there? 2,000. So originally, there were 500,000 Tule elk in California. So remember when I showed you that range map? Originally, there were 500,000. Now, at that time in 1971, they set the goal of 2,000. So that's quite different than 500,000. Or it could be determined there was no longer suitable habitat for the elk. So the state said, we're going to get the elk to 2,000. The federal law was a little bit different. It was similar in that it said we're going to have 2,000 elk. And the Owens Valley, which is on the eastern side, they said that herd will not exceed 490. And so again, they required the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, and Secretary of Defense of the federal government to cooperate with the state of California in making federal lands available so that Tule elk numbers could increase. So again, that was the Tule Elk Preservation Act. So by 1983, this is when I began my work in the early 80s, so I began to track elk in the 1981, 82, and this was the Tule elk herd locations at that time. So you can see here's where the elk are all located. Again, Owens Valley is not part of their native habitat, but the rest of these are. And then you can see here in the area where you live, in the Bay Area, this is the Mount Hamilton area of the Diablo Range, Fremont Peaks, Concord Naval Station. These were some of the areas in the local areas where the elk were reduced. And this is where my original work occurred, was in Mount Hamilton region of the Diablo Range. So here is the case study where I spent my time studying the Tule elk. The Tule elk were reintroduced into the San Felipe Ranch, a ranch owned by Hewlett and Packard, and they wanted elk reintroduced. So you can see here's San Jose, and then here's up in the Diablo Range, and their ranch is up in here. Well, the original reintroductions that occurred at this ranch were not successful. The elk were brought in released, and the elk took off. They went up north, they went out to the east, they went kind of south down to Pacheco Pass, and so on. So they pretty much left the ranch. So another attempt was made, and that's when I was brought in to actually study the elk at San Felipe. And here it is Look at how beautiful it is. So this is up in the Diablo Range, which is east of you here, the school here in San Jose area, Cupertino area, and so on. And this is what it looks like. Look at these oak woodlands. So the Tule elk co-evolved with these beautiful oak woodlands. These are all deciduous and evergreen oaks. And this area is called Horse Valley. Isn't it just beautiful? And so the elk were brought into these areas, hoping to reintroduce them. And here's the view looking out towards this is the Diablo Range, oops. And you're looking here to the west towards Loma Prieta. Here's the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we're standing here in the Diablo Range. So the valley would be right between us. And look at how beautiful it is. So this is perfect elk habitat. So again, efforts were made to bring the Tule elk back to the Hewlett-Packard Ranch. And so they were reintroduced, put back to native habitat. And again, these are some of the areas that they were reintroduced to. And so here's the San Felipe Ranch. And so the elk were brought in. And this time it was decided that they were going to actually put the elk in pens and let them calm down prior to reintroducing them. So they were brought in by trailers. These are special trailers by the California Department of Fish and Game, now California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They brought these elk in, and they were put into these pinned areas, so the elk couldn't get out of these pinned areas. The elk will try to get out unless there's a cover like this. So putting a cover on the fencing actually keeps the elk from trying to get out, which is kind of interesting. These guys can jump a 6-foot fence. They're pretty amazing. But when you put this barrier around them, it keeps the elk from trying to get out. And again, you can see these oaks here. These are all deciduous oaks. So they were brought in the fall. And the elk were brought in. You can see them in here. They were kept in this area for a few months. And then my job was to come in and to follow the elk, which is kind of cool. The elk were fitted, the females were fitted with radio telemetry collars. So these collars emit a signal that tells you where the elk locations are. And so radio telemetry is absolutely critical in this kind of research, in this kind of mountainous country, because it's very difficult to find them. And you could track them from the air, from airplanes, or on the ground. So we had people that would go out and track their locations if they left the ranch. And then my job was to be on the ground and go in and try to find where they were. So the females were fitted with collars. The males weren't. The males' necks will tend to swell during certain seasons, and so that wasn't a good thing to have collars on the male elk and so on the bulls. So eventually they learned a lot through this concept of radio telemetry. And so again, my job was to go out to track the elk, monitor their locations, and see if the reintroduction was going to be successful on the Hewlett-Packard Ranch in Santa Clara County. And I had an assistant that would help me in the field. I don't know if you've seen him before, but this is our son Ryan. And Ryan began tracking elk when he was about 3.5 to 4 years old. So he was out there pretty early. And you can see here he's demonstrating the radio telemetry equipment. Here's the antenna, here's the receiver, and he's got the headsets on. And so his job was to go out and track the elk at a very young age. So he has little boots on, and he put in a lot of miles tracking the elk. And so here I am with a botanist from San Jose State. And one of the things that I had to learn is I loved wildlife. I didn't really necessarily know all my plants, and I soon learned that elks are grazers and browsers. They feed on grasses, and they browse. They feed on shrubs and trees and so on. So I had to learn my plants, which I kind of said, gee, I didn't sign up for this. So here I was a graduate student at San Jose State University, and my job was to learn all the plants, which was crazy because I thought, well, I want to study wildlife. And they said, well, you have to learn all your plants. So this wonderful professor helped me learn a lot of my plants because my job was to figure out what they were eating, where they were moving through, what was their home range size, how were they adapting to these areas. And so again, I began this journey studying the elk on the ranch, and it was cool. The elk were released, and they kind of hung out in the areas that were targeted for the elk, so it was really hopeful. And so here's some of the other areas that the elk were found, and my job was to go out and check them out as well. And so there are some just beautiful locations. There's beautiful locations in Santa Clara County that are perfect elk habitat. And also just kind of noticing that there's other species that have been studied this way that are so critical for California. There's our pronghorn and our black-tailed deer. And here, these are wild pigs, which are non-native. They're exotics. And then our beautiful mountain lions. So we have our prey and our predator species. And so again, how all these interact is instrumental to the whole field of ecology and wildlife studies. I also was brought in by California Department of Fish and Game to follow the reintroduction of elk into Carrizo Plains National Monument. And I wanted to kind of show you this to show you what the crazy things that the elk do. This is San Luis Obispo County. And this is where the elk were reintroduced into the Carrizo Plains. It's a national monument, so it's Carrizo Plains Range. And so you can see what happened with those elk reintroductions. Bakersfield would be over here. This is part of their native habitat, and you can see what happened after the elk were released. They went all over the place, and my job was to go out again and find them. It was difficult because they went on to private lands. I'd have to get permission to get on the land, so my job was to figure out between 1981 and 82, all the way through 1987, 88, what had happened in these original reintroductions. And you can see in the Carrizo Plains, look at the habitat. Can you see the elk there? Isn't it cool? So look at how they hang out in here. And again, it was pretty fun, but it was a challenge because, again, there were so many different lands. And this is out there in that area around Carrizo Plains. Some of the elk actually traveled through from Carrizo Plains out towards Interstate 5 and actually tried to get across Interstate 5. So there was difficulties that happened. And again, this just shows you the beautiful herd. These are almost all cows. They have ear tags on. Some have radio telemetry collars, but look at how beautiful they are. Look at how they blend into the natural environment. So again, legislation initially mandated that we do responsible management from 1971 to 1997, the Bear Bill, and reintroduction was used as a primary management tool. That is, how do you take the elk and reintroduce them back into their native habitat, which is so critical. And so the mandate was revoked once they reached their state numbers of 2,000. From 1988 to 2020, hunting has now become the primary tool utilized by the state California Department of Fish and Wildlife because there's not many more relocation sites, although they do still move them here and there. And right now our state count is what? What's it say right here? There's 5,700 Tule elk. That's only about a little over 1% of the original population of how much? 500,000. So you can see here that the Tule elk went through what's called a population bottleneck. It went from probably 500,000 elk to maybe less than 20 were found at that Henry Miller's ranch in the Bakersfield, Buena Vista area. So the elk went through a population bottleneck, which means you have to be concerned about how much genetic health is left. You lost many of those gene alleles, and so every elk becomes important. So Tule elk numbers, again, are 5,700. They're found among approximately 25 herds statewide. They're managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Some of the herds that I studied in my Tule elk guide have actually disappeared. So the Hewlett-Packard Ranch, we went out there the last few years, and the Tule elk have pretty much disappeared from the Hewlett-Packard Ranch. They're still found somewhat in the Carrizo Plains, but many of the herds we thought would be there have disappeared as well. So something's happening behind the scenes. So reintroduction tool has been replaced with hunting as a primary management tool. And one of the important things about that is less than 1% of the California public actually hunts. Most of the people that come in to get hunting licenses, which Fish and Game issues to shoot the elk and so on, are from out of state. And one of the other problems is there's actually almost no connectivity, no viable what we call meta populations between Tule elks. They can't move between the different herds statewide, and that's a serious problem because you get inbreeding and other kinds of concerns. So where do we go from here is the question. And that's why hopefully students like you that are taking environmental science courses that care about these things, you have to help us come up with solutions because we're not really sure what we can do from this. There needs to be more studies done, more understanding of what happened to the Tule elk, and there needs to be more public education. And what I found in my work, what others have found, is public sentiment really supports in California protecting and restoring our wild species, including the Tule elk. These are great success stories. The elk are back. Again, there's only 5,700 or so, maybe, and again, some are hard to find. And what kind of tools do we use? So the concept of preservation, preserving them in their natural state, putting them back into their native habitat, reintroducing them into their native habitat, the concept of restoration, how do we restore those wild populations, and not just in wild areas, but urban areas as well, as you see in Santa Clara County. So native landscaping, reforestation, buffer zones, and having urban guidelines for wildlife. And so there's just a lot of cool concepts now. There's a lot of students studying this field, the fields of landscape ecology, corridor ecology, restoration ecology, really exciting, environmental biology, so many exciting fields. And again, these will be the challenges of this century. So 21st century thinkers are needed for protecting our biodiversity. Our biodiversity is really at stake here. And so again, conservation biology, as I mentioned, landscape ecology, ecosystem management, these are so important. And here's the different areas within that. You know, wildlands connectivity, having these natural corridors, The value of wildlife is pretty much understood in the state of California. And again, much of the public sentiment in my lifetime has really shifted towards protection of native wildlife. And this concept of land stewardship, which is a team approach, which I really love, community-based conservation, where the public is key and a key stakeholder in the process. So you don't get to just say, well, I think native wildlife is cool, this or that. You're actually called a stakeholder. And that means you have a vested interest in protecting these elk. And these resource agencies must develop a team approach. That is, it can't just be a top-down California Department of Fish and Wildlife decide, well, we're going to just hunt the elk. No, there needs to be a team approach to protecting our species. And so again, management, which emphasizes knowledge and understanding of the landscape and the right of wildlife to move over the landscape over time, both human and natural systems. And I think that's really an important concept. You have the right to have wildlife, native wildlife, on your public lands, and they should also be protected on private lands and follow certain rules. Can't just go out and shoot them because they're on your land, which has happened a lot. You ever heard of 3 S's? Shoot, shovel, and shut up. So people basically, during the when people aren't on their land, sometimes they'll go out and shoot them, they bury them, and so my job was to pick up the elk when I was doing these studies, and it was very difficult because I get a call, hey, there's a mortality mode. Looks like an elk went down that has a radio collar on. You got to go pick it up. So I drive out. I'd find the elk. It obviously had been shot, and the people didn't know when they shot it that it had a collar on it. When they see the collar, they just leave it. So I had to remove the bullets from its brain, and then I would turn them over to Fish and Game, and they never prosecuted a single case. So it was very, very difficult. A lot of elk were killed in that way. Many survived, and there was a lot of good landowners out there, ranchers that actually cared about the elk, and they were really good advocates. So again, it's so important to look at this balance between commodities, amenities, and ecological integrity. And so solutions are developed through discussions among all the stakeholders, which includes you. And so I love this concept of consensus-based, multiple issues, and partnerships. So ecosystem management, community-based conservation, I love this part. Can we read this together? Would you mind reading this with me, please? It is about people who care so much about their quality of life today and in the future that they have chosen to work with others to improve the places where they live, work, and play while restoring the land. It's about the interface, and I love this one. When you look at the elk, it's about the interface between science, people, and their governments as they struggle to understand their collective impacts on ecosystems and change their approaches. So you may have heard about these issues around wildlife before. Hopefully you have. The K-12 system is so incredible and important to teach our students. We need people to go into this field that teach in the K-12 system. That if they aren't, they need to add that to the curriculum. We need to do this in our community college, which Deanne's has done a good job, and we need to do it in our universities, and we need to reach out to the public. So I love to show this picture. This is a group of students who went down with me to Carrizo Plains to actually study the elk. They got to go out. We did a weekend field trip, and we were out on some private lands where these people are protecting the Tule elk, which is absolutely incredible. These are private lands where the elk are a priority, and they're restoring the native landscape. And you can see kind of in the background here, the cool part about the elk is when they're brought into areas where they originally were found, they help restore the native perennial bunch grasses. You can see the bunch grasses returning. They help restore the native oaks, the native shrubs. So elk play a critical role in ecological conservation. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope you'll help us in the fight to save the Tule elk. You can check out more on our website, naturebasedteaching.com. And onto that, you go into the tab under Tule elk, and you see our Tule elk guide, and we have Tule elk curriculum, and it gives you a nice historical overview of the Tule elk as well. So again, that's naturebasedteaching.com. And my hope is that you'll continue to help save the elk in California because, again, we're the only state that has our own subspecies of North American elk, the Tule elk. Have a great day, and thank you so much.